Ma'am, we've had multiple noise complaints from this address. Possible.
My home has been quiet.
Don't argue with me. This address was
That
made.
information is none of your business. You do not have permission to enter. Step back right now.
You're being uncooperative.
The doorbell rang at exactly 7:32 that evening. Judge Rebecca Lawson had just finished going through case files for the next day's hearings when the sound echoed through her quiet suburban house. She was not expecting any visitors. Her husband was away on a work trip, and her grown children lived in other states. She placed her reading glasses on the table and walked toward the front door. Looking through the peephole, she saw two police officers standing on her porch. Their uniforms were neat, and their badges shined under the porch light. One officer was taller, around his early 40s, with gray starting to show at his temples. He was holding a clipboard. The other officer was a younger woman with her hair pulled back tightly in a bun. She stood a step behind him, carefully looking around the neighborhood. Rebecca unlocked the door but only opened it partway, keeping the safety chain fastened. Calmly, she asked how she could help them. The older officer introduced himself as Sergeant David Kane, and he said his partner was Officer Elisa Rodriguez. He explained that they were responding to a noise complaint from the neighborhood and needed to speak with the homeowner. Rebecca immediately felt confused. Her house had been completely quiet all evening. She had been sitting in her study, reading, with soft classical music playing in the background. Nothing loud enough to bother anyone. She told the officers there must be some kind of mistake. The house had been peaceful, and she was alone while her husband was traveling. Sergeant Kane looked down at his clipboard and read out her address, confirming they were at the correct house. He said several neighbors had called to report loud music and shouting coming from this address. Rebecca knew that could not be true. She asked which neighbors had complained, but Kane said he could not share that information. Something about his tone made her uneasy. Rebecca had been a judge for 15 years and had worked as a prosecutor. Before that, she trusted her instincts, and this situation felt wrong from the very beginning. Before we go any further into what happened next, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because this story takes shocking turns you won't want to miss. What began as a simple noise complaint would eventually destroy careers and expose corruption at the highest levels of local law enforcement. Judge Rebecca Lawson was not an ordinary citizen. At 53 years old, she had earned a spotless reputation as one of the most respected judges in the state. She had handled major cases involving organized crime, political corruption, and civil rights violations. Her courtroom was known for fairness, careful preparation, and zero tolerance for misconduct, especially from law enforcement officers who tried to twist the truth. She lived in Millbrook Heights, a well-off neighborhood where she had lived for more than 10 years. Her neighbors knew her personally. She hosted yearly block parties, donated to community fundraisers, and kept her home in perfect condition. The idea that multiple neighbors would complain about noise from her house was not just unlikely, it was completely absurd. Standing at her door that night, Rebecca made a decision that would turn out to be very important. She asked the officers to wait while she grabbed her phone. She wanted to call her nearby neighbors to confirm whether anyone had actually complained. This was a reasonable request from a homeowner trying to understand the situation. Sergeant Kane's response was fast and revealing. He became irritated and said that wasn't necessary. He told her they needed to come inside immediately to investigate the complaint. When Rebecca asked if they had a warrant, Kane's attitude changed instantly. His voice grew louder and more aggressive. He said they did not need a warrant for a noise complaint and accused her of being uncooperative. Rebecca stayed calm but firm. She explained that she had not committed any crime, there was no disturbance happening, and she would not allow them inside without a warrant. She offered to give her contact details so they could follow up properly if needed. That was when Sergeant Kane made his first serious mistake. He placed his foot in the doorway to stop her from closing the door. Rebecca told him clearly to remove his foot and step off her property. Instead, Kane pushed the door open, snapping the chain latch. Officer Rodriguez followed him inside without hesitation. What the officers did not know was that Rebecca had recently installed a full security system throughout her home. Cameras with audio recording covered every room and entrance. Every moment of what happened next was being recorded in clear, high-quality video and sound. Kane demanded that Rebecca show identification immediately. When she asked why she needed to provide ID for a noise complaint at her own home, said she was acting suspicious and they needed to confirm she actually lived there. Rebecca understood right away what was happening. She calmly walked to her purse and took out her driver's license, which clearly showed her name and the same address they were standing in. Kane stared at the license for an unusually long time before handing it back. He then asked her what she did for a living. Rebecca found the question inappropriate and unrelated to any noise complaint, but she answered truthfully. She said she was a judge. Both officers reacted instantly. Kane's eyes widened, and Officer Rodriguez stepped back. Kane asked her to repeat herself. Rebecca clearly said she was a circuit court judge and had been one for 15 years. She again asked why they were really in her home and requested to see the complaint report. That was when everything escalated. Instead of apologizing and leaving, Sergeant Kane became more aggressive. He said he did not believe she was a judge and demanded more proof. He claimed anyone could say anything and insisted her behavior was still suspicious. Officer Rodriguez began walking around the living room, looking through Rebecca's belongings without permission. Rebecca had had enough. She firmly told both officers that they were trespassing and needed to leave immediately. She warned them that she would file a formal complaint with their department and that their actions were unacceptable. Kane responded by saying she was being belligerent and claimed he could arrest her for interfering with a police investigation. What happened next would later become the focus of several federal lawsuits. Rebecca walked into her home office and returned with her official judicial identification badge and her business cards. She handed them to Kane, who examined them closely. The badge was real and officially issued by the state court administration. Her business cards clearly showed her title as the Honorable Rebecca Lawson, Circuit Court Judge. Kane stared at the badge and cards for almost a full minute, while Rodriguez leaned in to look over his shoulder. Rebecca could see the moment when recognition finally appeared on their faces. But instead of apologizing and leaving, the officers made another disastrous choice. Kane claimed the identification could be fake and said they would need to verify her identity through official channels. Rebecca told them there were many simple ways to do that. They could call the courthouse, the sheriff's department, or even the mayor's office. Any one of those places would immediately confirm who she was. Kane ignored her suggestion and said they would have to take her to the police station to verify her identity properly. At that moment, Rebecca realized she was dealing with officers who were either dangerously incompetent or deeply corrupt. She told them clearly that she was not going anywhere and that they were breaking several laws by staying in her home. She said she was calling her attorney, the chief of police, right away. Kane responded by telling her she was under arrest for obstruction of justice. Rodriguez stepped closer to her, preparing to put her in handcuffs. Rebecca stepped back and spoke loudly and clearly. She said she did not consent to any arrest, that no crime had been committed, that she was a sitting judge being unlawfully detained inside her own home. This moment would shape everything that followed. Rebecca's security cameras recorded Kane reaching for his handcuffs while Rodriguez positioned herself behind her. The audio captured Rebecca repeatedly stating her judicial position and demanding that the officers leave her property. But Kane and Rodriguez had already gone too far. They were fully committed to a decision that would end their careers and expose behavior that had stayed hidden for years. What they did not know was that Judge Rebecca Lawson had been reviewing police misconduct cases in her courtroom for months. She recognized both of their names from complaints that had passed across her desk. Over the next few minutes, multiple camera angles captured Rebecca being handcuffed in her own living room by two officers who had no legal reason to be there. That footage would later be shown in federal court, studied by constitutional law experts, and aired on national news. Have you ever personally witnessed police misconduct? Type yes in the comments if you have. because what happened to Judge Lawson that night was only the beginning of a much larger story. As Kane locked the handcuffs around Rebecca's wrists, she continued to calmly state that she was a circuit court judge being unlawfully arrested. Both officers understood the seriousness of what they were doing, but they chose to continue anyway. They were determined to see it through, no matter the consequences. As Rebecca was escorted outside in handcuffs, her neighbors began coming out of their homes. News spread quickly through Millbrook Heights that something was happening at the judge's house. Several residents pulled out their phones and started recording. Mrs. Henderson from next door called out, asking if Rebecca was okay. Mr. Chen from across the street shouted that there had to be some kind of mistake. Sergeant Kane ordered the crowd to disperse and mind their own business. But these were not strangers. These were Rebecca's neighbors, people who had known her for more than 10 years. They knew she was a respected judge, and they knew something was terribly wrong. 3 different neighbors independently called the courthouse emergency line to report that Judge Lawson was being arrested at her home. The drive to the police station was recorded by the patrol car's dashboard camera. Rebecca sat calmly in the back seat, still handcuffed, telling the officers they were making a career-ending mistake. She reminded them about the security cameras in her home that had recorded everything. She warned them that unlawfully arresting a sitting judge was a federal crime that could lead to decades in prison. Kane brushed off her warnings and told her she could explain herself to the booking officer. Rodriguez stayed quiet, but the dashboard camera showed her repeatedly glancing nervously at Kane. She was beginning to understand how serious their mistake was, but it was already too late to turn back. At the police station, the situation quickly went from bad to catastrophic. The desk sergeant, a 20-year veteran named Michael Torres, immediately recognized Rebecca when she was brought in. His face turned pale when he saw her in handcuffs. Torres had appeared in Rebecca's courtroom many times over the years. He knew exactly who she was and what her arrest would mean. Torres quietly asked Kane to step aside for a private conversation. The lobby cameras recorded their tense discussion, though the audio was unclear. Torres gestured wildly while Kane looked defensive and angry. After several minutes, Torres returned to the desk and began making phone calls. First, he called the chief of police, then the mayor, then the district attorney. Within 30 minutes, the police station lobby filled with local officials. The chief of police arrived first, followed by the mayor, the district attorney, and 2 city council members. Each of them needed only one glance at Judge Rebecca Lawson sitting in handcuffs to understand that a political disaster was unfolding. Chief Williams immediately ordered the handcuffs removed and personally apologized to Rebecca. He promised a full investigation and assured her that disciplinary action would be taken. But Rebecca was not satisfied. She had been illegally arrested in her own home by officers who ignored her identification and refused to listen to her. The chief asked if she would be willing to speak privately in his office. Rebecca agreed, but only if her attorney was present. She called her longtime friend and legal colleague, David Brennan, one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the state. Brennan arrived within an hour, and what he saw in the initial reports shocked even him. Inside the chief's office, Rebecca carefully explained everything from the moment the officers rang her doorbell. She described the fake noise complaint, the forced entry, the refusal to accept her identification, and the unlawful arrest. Chief Williams listened in disbelief as the full story came out. Then Rebecca revealed something even more disturbing. For the past 6 months, she had been quietly documenting a pattern of misconduct involving certain officers in the department. Sergeant Kane's name appeared in multiple complaints. Citizens had accused him of racial profiling, illegal searches, and filing false reports. Rebecca had planned to raise these concerns through official channels. Instead, she had become a victim of the same misconduct she had been investigating. The irony of the situation was overwhelming. The legal consequences were massive. Attorney Brennan immediately asked for copies of every report connected to that night, including the original noise complaint. When Chief Williams searched the system, he uncovered something that stunned everyone in the room. There was no noise complaint on record. No neighbors had called. No reports had been filed at all. The entire reason given for the officers going to Rebecca's home had been completely made up. This discovery changed everything. What could have been explained as confusion or bad judgment was now clear evidence of criminal behavior. Kane and Rodriguez had deliberately gone to Judge Rebecca Lawson's home under false pretenses. Everyone in the room was thinking the same question, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. Why? The answer began to surface in the weeks that followed. Once federal investigators took control of the case, what they uncovered was a deep web of corruption that went far beyond one night and two officers. Investigators learned that Kane was part of a group within the police department that had been systematically targeting successful African-American residents living in wealthy neighborhoods. Judge Rebecca Lawson was African-American, one of only 3 black judges in the entire circuit. She lived in a mostly white neighborhood and drove an expensive car. Kane and his associates had chosen her as a target because they could not believe a black woman could legitimately afford that lifestyle. The investigation revealed that over the past 2 years, Kane had initiated contact with at least 15 other prominent black residents using false excuses. He carried out illegal searches, wrote false reports, and in some cases made arrests that were later dismissed because there was no evidence. The pattern was clear, deliberate, and fully documented in Kane's own police records. Once federal prosecutors understood how serious the conspiracy was, they moved quickly. Kane was arrested at his home just 5 days after the incident at Rebecca's house. Rodriguez was arrested the same day. Both officers were charged with civil rights violations, conspiracy, false imprisonment, and deprivation of rights under color of law. These federal charges carried possible sentences of up to 20 years in prison for each of them. But the story did not end there. Kane and Rodriguez were not acting alone. The investigation widened to include other officers who had taken part in or helped cover up similar actions. Phone records showed that Kane had been in regular contact with a network of officers across several precincts who shared his beliefs and tactics. Text messages recovered from Kane's phone contained clear racial slurs and detailed discussions about targeting specific people and neighborhoods. One message thread mentioned Rebecca directly, describing her as an uppity target who needed to be put in her place. The messages showed that Kane had been watching her home for weeks, learning her schedule, and waiting for a moment when she was alone and vulnerable. The scale of the conspiracy shocked even experienced federal investigators. This was not a case of a few officers making bad choices. It was an organized effort to intimidate and harass successful black residents by abusing police power. Judge Rebecca Lawson's arrest had accidentally exposed one of the largest police corruption scandals in the state's history. But while the public impact was huge, the personal cost to Rebecca was severe, and the legal fight was only beginning. The key question now was whether the justice system would truly hold the officers accountable and deliver real consequences for their actions. As news of the arrest spread, more victims came forward with their own stories of harassment and intimidation. With each new account, the size of the conspiracy became clear. It was obvious that what happened to Rebecca was only the tip of a very large iceberg. The federal investigation moved faster and further than anyone expected. With 2 weeks of Rebecca's arrest, FBI agents executed search warrants on Kane's home, Rodriguez's apartment, and the personal devices of 17 other officers across 4 different precincts. What they found revealed corruption so widespread that even seasoned investigators were stunned. Kane's computer contained detailed files on more than 60 prominent black residents across the metropolitan area. Each file included photographs, home addresses, vehicle details, work schedules, and what Kane labeled as threat assessments. These assessments had nothing to do with real criminal behavior. Instead, they focused on how successful, influential, or visible these individuals were in their communities. One file belonged to Dr. Michael Franklin, a well-known heart surgeon who saved lives every day. Over a 2-year period, he had been stopped 11 times while driving to and from the hospital. Each stop involved long searches and delays that sometimes lasted for hours. Kane's files showed that these stops were planned and coordinated, meant to harass and intimidate rather than protect public safety. Sarah Washington, a successful real estate developer who had focused on building affordable housing in underserved communities, had also been targeted. She faced fake code enforcement visits and false investigations into her business. Kane's records showed that he had been feeding false information to different city departments to trigger these harassment campaigns. The list of victims kept growing. Business owners, doctors, lawyers, teachers, and community leaders had all been deliberately targeted. The common factor was not criminal behavior or real law enforcement concerns. The common factor was their success, their visibility, and the color of their skin. Attorney David Brennan worked nonstop, building the federal criminal case while also preparing civil lawsuits for Rebecca and the growing number of victims. The evidence was overwhelming, but Brennan knew corruption cases often ran into serious challenges. Officers had qualified immunity, co-workers who might hide or destroy evidence, and powerful union lawyers trained to reduce consequences. This case, however, was different. The video footage from Rebecca's home security system was clear and impossible to deny. The text messages between officers were direct and disturbing. The pattern of misconduct was so widespread that it could not be dismissed as isolated mistakes or bad judgment. Judge Rebecca Lawson then made a decision that surprised almost everyone, including her own attorney. She announced that she would continue handling her normal caseload while the federal prosecution moved forward. Many people encouraged her to step away from the bench until everything was resolved. Rebecca refused. She explained that stepping aside would send the wrong message. It would suggest that the officers had succeeded in intimidating her. Instead, Rebecca chose to show the community that justice could not be shaken by corruption. She wanted to prove that the rule of law was stronger than any individual officer's criminal actions. Her decision created logistical challenges. Security at the courthouse had to be increased. She received constant protection, and federal marshals screened everyone entering her courtroom. Still, she remained determined to show that democracy and justice would continue to function. Her first day back on the bench attracted national media attention. Reporters packed the courtroom, cameras lined the courthouse steps, and legal experts discussed the extraordinary situation. A judge who had been unlawfully arrested was now presiding over cases while the officers responsible faced federal charges. The symbolism was powerful and intentional. Rebecca used her position to speak openly about justice, fairness, and accountability. She stressed that no one should be above the law, no matter their rank or authority. Her message reached far beyond her courtroom and became a rallying point for police reform advocates across the country. Meanwhile, the criminal case against Cain and Rodriguez moved forward quickly. Federal prosecutors assembled a team of 8 attorneys to handle the complex conspiracy charges. The amount of evidence was so large that multiple prosecutors were needed just to organize and present it properly. Cain's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal early on. He claimed his client was a decorated officer who had made poor decisions under pressure. He argued that Cain did not intend to target people based on race, and said the text messages were misunderstood. Prosecutors rejected this argument immediately. The evidence showed clear planning, coordination, and intentional racial targeting. This was not a case of unconscious bias or simple mistakes. It was calculated criminal behavior that violated the civil rights of dozens of people. Rodriguez's case was somewhat different. Her lawyer argued that she was a junior officer who had been following orders from a superior. Phone records showed she had privately expressed concerns about some of Cain's actions to family members. Her attorney portrayed her as someone who had been pulled into the conspiracy rather than leading it. However, prosecutors had strong evidence that Rodriguez willingly participated in many incidents beyond Rebecca's arrest. She took part in illegal searches, filed false reports, and helped coordinate surveillance of targeted individuals. While her lower rank might reduce her sentence, it did not excuse her actions. As the investigation continued, it expanded far beyond the 2 officers. Detective James Mitchell was found to have provided Cain with confidential information about wealthy black residents using illegal database searches. Officer Robert Hayes had falsified reports to cover up unlawful stops and searches. Sergeant Lisa Coleman had supervised several targeting operations and helped organize the conspiracy. Each new arrest sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. Officers who once felt protected by the so-called blue wall of silence began to fear exposure. Some started cooperating with federal investigators, sharing information about additional crimes and cover-ups. At first, the police union defended all the arrested officers, emphasizing due process and the presumption of innocence. But as more evidence became public, union leaders distanced themselves from the conspiracy. They hired separate attorneys and focused on protecting officers who were not involved. Public pressure for major reform continued to grow. Community leaders demanded Chief Williams resign, arguing that corruption of this size could not exist without serious oversight failures. City council meetings turned into heated debates about police accountability, transparency, and civilian oversight. Chief Williams announced a full review of all cases handled by the arrested officers over the past 5 years. This massive review would cover thousands of arrests, searches, and incidents, reports to identify more victims and uncover any wrongful convictions. The scope of the work was enormous and expected to take years to complete. Judge Rebecca Lawson used her platform to push for broader, systemic changes beyond just prosecuting the guilty officers. She spoke at police training seminars about constitutional rights and proper procedures. She worked with community groups to improve relations between law enforcement and citizens. While continuing her regular judicial duties, she became a national voice for justice reform. Media attention on Rebecca was intense and mostly supportive. National news programs highlighted her story as an example of how corruption could be exposed when victims refused to remain silent. Civil rights organizations praised her courage and determination to demand accountability instead of quietly settling. However, not all attention was positive. Rebecca received threatening phone calls and emails from people supporting the arrested officers. Some contained racial slurs and direct threats of violence. Federal investigators took these threats seriously, increasing her personal security. The criminal trial was set to begin 6 months after the initial arrests. Prosecutors stated they would seek the maximum federal penalties. Cain faced up to 25 years in prison for the most serious charges, while Rodriguez and other defendants faced sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years, depending on their involvement. The trial was set in federal court with a jury drawn from the broader metropolitan area rather than the local community to reduce potential bias. As the trial approached, more victims came forward to share their experiences of harassment and intimidation. The prosecution's witness list grew to include over 40 individuals targeted by the conspiracy. Their testimonies would show the systematic nature of the crimes and the severe impact on their lives. Dr. Franklin testified about missing critical surgeries due to the repeated stops by Cain. Sarah Washington described how the fake investigations had cost her millions in delayed projects and damaged business relationships. Other victims shared stories of fear, humiliation, and constant stress from being targeted by those sworn to protect them. The defense faced an almost impossible task. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern undeniable, and the victims credible and sympathetic. Their only realistic strategy was to try to reduce sentences by emphasizing cooperation and responsibility. But Cain refused to accept any responsibility. He claimed he had been conducting legitimate law enforcement work and that any targeting was based on suspicious behavior rather than race. This stance made it impossible for his attorney to negotiate a meaningful plea deal. The trial promised to be a historic moment for police accountability and civil rights enforcement. Legal experts said its outcome could influence how similar cases were prosecuted nationwide. The stakes were high not only for the defendants, but for the broader cause of justice and equality under the law. Throughout this period, Judge Rebecca Lawson continued working, knowing that her courage and resolve were being watched by victims, advocates, and potential future targets of police misconduct. She had become a symbol of resistance to corruption, proof that even the most powerful institutions could be held accountable when people refused to accept injustice. What began as a fabricated noise complaint had grown into one of the most significant police corruption cases in decades. But the true test was about to come in the courtroom, where evidence would be presented, witnesses would testify, and a jury would decide whether justice would truly be served. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in February. News vans, protesters, and curious onlookers surrounded the federal courthouse, all following the case closely. Inside, the courtroom was packed with victims, family members, civil rights advocates, and law enforcement officials eager to see how this unprecedented trial would unfold. Lead prosecutor Amanda Sterling opened the case, describing a web of systematic corruption that shocked even those familiar with the story. She explained how Cain and his associates operated like an organized crime syndicate, use their badges and authority to intimidate innocent citizens solely because of their race. Sterling told the jury they would see text messages in which Kane referred to successful black residents as targets who needed to be reminded of their place. The jury would hear from victims whose lives had been upended, businesses ruined, and families traumatized by officers sworn to serve and protect. Most importantly, they would see video evidence showing the conspiracy in action. Kane's defense attorney, Robert Kessler, faced an almost impossible task from the start. He tried to argue that his client was a dedicated officer who had made a few mistakes, but never acted with criminal intent. He claimed the text messages were taken out of context and insisted that targeting was based on legitimate law enforcement concerns, not race. But Kessler's arguments fell apart when Sterling presented the security footage from Rebecca's home. The jury watched in stunned silence as Kane forced his way into her house, ignored her identification, and arrested her despite clear proof that she was exactly who she claimed to be. The audio captured every word, every dismissive comment, and every escalation of the illegal detention. The most damning evidence came from Kane's own phone records and computer files. Prosecutors displayed his detailed targeting lists on large screens for the jury. Each profile contained photographs, personal information, and notes that had nothing to do with criminal activity but everything to do with success, visibility, and race. Dr. Franklin's testimony was especially powerful. He described how Kane's repeated traffic stops had caused him to miss critical surgeries, potentially putting patients' lives at risk. He told the jury about the humiliation of being handcuffed on the side of the road while wearing scrubs on his way to save lives. His voice cracked as he recalled having to explain to a patient's family why their loved one's surgery had been delayed because he was being detained for driving while black. Sarah Washington testified about the economic impact of the conspiracy. She presented evidence showing Kane's false reports to city agencies had cost her company over $2 million in delayed projects and canceled contracts. She had to lay off employees and abandon community development plans because of the fraudulent investigations Kane had started. Business owner Marcus Johnson spoke about the psychological toll. He described the anxiety of leaving his house each morning, never knowing if Kane would find another excuse to harass him. He had installed security cameras and hired private guards, spending thousands of dollars just to protect himself from the very people meant to protect the public. The prosecution's case strengthened with each witness. Teacher Dorothy Evans testified that Kane had shown up at her school under the pretense of investigating drug activity, humiliating her in front of students and colleagues. No drugs were ever found. The entire event was meant to intimidate her. For speaking out at city council meetings about police misconduct, community leader Robert Hayes described how Kane had tried to frame him for crimes he didn't commit. Kane planted evidence during a traffic stop and filed false reports claiming Hayes was dealing drugs. Only an honest patrol officer intervened, preventing Hayes from being wrongly convicted and imprisoned. The text messages were devastating. Prosecutors showed hundreds of messages between Kane and his co-conspirator, planning harassment operations and celebrating their successes. The language was explicitly racist, proving intent to violate civil rights. One message had Kane boasting about making Dr. Franklin miss a surgery, saying he enjoyed watching successful black people squirm when reminded they weren't really in charge. Another message referred to Rebecca specifically, with Kane writing that he couldn't wait to show the uppity judge who really had power. Rodriguez's testimony as a cooperating witness provided key insider details about how the conspiracy operated. She had pled guilty and agreed to testify truthfully in exchange for a reduced sentence, understanding that cooperation was her only chance to avoid decades in federal prison. After just under 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict, guilty on all counts. Kane was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison, while Rodriguez received 8 years for her cooperation. Other conspirators received sentences ranging from 6 to 15 years. Their law enforcement careers were finished, pension forfeited, and their names forever associated with one of the most shameful episodes in police history. Judge Rebecca Lawson stood on the courthouse steps after the sentencing, surrounded by the victims who had found their voices and demanded justice. She spoke about how a single fabricated noise complaint had unraveled an entire network of corruption, proving that truth and accountability could prevail even against those who believed themselves untouchable. The case led to sweeping reforms in police departments nationwide. New oversight mechanisms, mandatory body cameras, and civilian review boards became standard. Most importantly, it sent a clear message: a badge and uniform do not provide immunity from the law. Rebecca continued serving as a judge for another decade before retiring to write and speak about justice reform. Cain served his full sentence and emerged a broken man with no prospects. Sometimes the system works exactly as it should, delivering consequences that match the crimes. What began with a doorbell ringing at 7:32 p.m. became a defining moment for civil rights and police accountability. Justice isn't always swift, but when it comes, it can be absolutely devastating to those who thought they were above the law. And as intense as this case was, there's another story right-hand side that's even more unbelievable.